All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on October 26th for the October LTI Roundtable meeting. And I'm just going to go ahead and get us kicked off, and then I'll be handing it over to Martin. So, hi, thank you for joining us. Please be aware that this meeting is held under the intellectual property rights policy adopted by IMS Global Learning Consortium, and you can download a copy of that policy on the public website at imsglobal.org/IP. I would ask that if you're in attendance, you inform me of any claims that are of any patent applications or issued patents that would likely be infringed by an implementation of the specification or other work product that is the subject of this meeting. You need not be the inventor of such patent or patent application in order to inform us of its existence, nor will you be held responsible for expressing a belief that turns out to be inaccurate. I'd also call your attention to the participant agreement. That one just says that work done in the groups should not be shared outside of the membership. I'm very hungry for cookies, which is why I got tripped up there. So thank you again for joining us, and please sign in at the agenda doc that is in the chat. We'll continue to post it throughout the meeting for those of you who may have joined late, but without further ado, I will hand it over to Martin Lenord, one of the LTI project group chairs.
All right, thanks very much. Yes, so as Josh has already said, my name is Martin Lenord, if you don't already know me. I'm a software engineer at Turnitin, and I help out with lots of LTI things, as well as co-chairing the LTI working group. So this is something that we've been working on for the last quite a while. It's been kind of an impending problem that is going to affect us more and more over time. So as a working group, we've wanted to preempt some of this work, and rather than having to do a mad scramble right at the very end when it suddenly starts affecting us, we've been working very hard to be prepared for when the inevitable does happen, and we lose access to our cookies, which will make everybody very sad. So a bit about the problem. So for people that aren't aware, they might not know why there's suddenly all of this upset about not having access to cookies and kind of what's being blocked and what isn't. So from an LTI standpoint, a lot of LTI tools, the usual workflow is to be opened inside an iframe. And there's one other kind of application that often gets opened inside an iframe, and that is an advert on a website. And browsers at the moment are doing their best to try and stop these advertising companies and advertising websites from being able to track you across sessions, monitor what you're doing. And because of that, a lot of extra restrictions are being put in place on any website that is loaded inside an iframe. And this causes issues for us, one of which is that we don't have access to cookies. So without access to cookies, what we're using cookies for currently, as most people who have built any kind of application will be aware, is you use a cookie to track your state. So you know that once you've been launched into your application, you know who you are, you know what your session is, you know who the user is that's clicking things, and any extra metadata around that. If we don't have a cookie, we might be able to load the first page after the launch, but we wouldn't be able to then continue on and any requests that you make after that, because subsequent requests would lose that cookie. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, can't this be solved by a single page application? And in a lot of cases, a single page application would be a complete solution to this problem. So for people that don't know the in-depth of it, the idea of a single page application is that rather than navigating between pages in an application, so actually changing the page that is loaded, you load one page, and then through JavaScript, you're loading in components and data using Ajax, rather than kind of loading in an entire page and changing where you are. That way, you can have the state in your browser and just pass it off to any requests that you're making without actually having to store it in a cookie. So a single page application is only part of the solution in our case. The problem that we have is to authenticate an LTI launch, we do what's known as an OpenID Connect login. And an OpenID Connect login actually requires the window to be navigated away from and then back to. And the reason for this is to make sure that we have some kind of state. It prevents kind of a type of man-in-the-middle attack, which is a forced login where I can force somebody else to get logged in as me. And the way that we do this is we check the state when it's passed, and we set one as a tool, get navigated away from, come back to the tool, and if the state is still there, then we know, hey, it was the same person that set the initial state that also launched into the application. So because of that, we needed to solve this kind of back and forth that we do in OpenID Connect when we don't have cookies. So what has the LTI working group been doing to fix this? We've been beavering away for a long time, trying to come up with solutions for this. We've had many spreadsheets full of different ideas, many hours of intense debate over which ones we should go for, what potential issues there might be. Things like security review. Obviously, if we're doing anything to do with storing state and sessions and potentially changing the flow to OpenID Connect, we need to make sure that what we're doing isn't introducing any more security vulnerabilities in the process of trying to fix one of them. So coming on to that, the spec that we have come up with, should you go and implement it now? Not just yet. So this is kind of a preview of what we're working on. It will hopefully be in a more public state very soon, but we are still going through some security review to make sure that we're not going to cause any problems for people, and we don't want people to try and implement this now and then suddenly have to roll it all back if we decide to change things later on. So unless you want to be on the bleeding edge and help us develop it, then I would not recommend implementing it just yet. All right, so how do we actually go about solving this problem? Here, this is going to be like a little bit of an example of a browser and how it would generally load an LTI tool and how we're going about storing this state that we use for OpenID Connect. So here you see I've got a browser tab open. This is representing the platform. So I'm at example.platform. And this is the top window. Okay, so the target is top or just window. And inside of that, we're going to open our tool, which is going to be inside an iframe. So there's going to be an iframe here, and that's going to load the tool. So the tool here, to do part of the OpenID Connect login flow, needs to be able to set a state. Usually it do this by setting it in the cookie, but in this case, we don't have access to cookies. So we can't set it in a cookie, so we need to store it somewhere else that is going to persist between us navigating away from this page and back to it. So the only other place that we actually have access to is the platform. So because we are a spec about integrating between tools and platforms, we can work together, and the platform can provide us somewhere to store this information temporarily. So how this works is the top frame has this little box here. So this represents kind of a local variable somewhere in its JavaScript or the platform's local storage. And it sections off a little bit of that for example.tool. So only things from example.tool are going to live in this box. And that way it knows that if something asks for information back out of the box, that it can only give it back to example.tool. And that way it stops somebody else from being able to pull out your state, a bit like a cookie. You can't go and read every cookie set by every website. It's limited to the domain that you're on. So how do we go and set that? To set something into this storage provided by the platform uses a window post message. So in the most kind of basic sense, what you'd be doing here is you'd be calling from this iframe as a tool. You call window.parent.postMessage, and you would send some data up to the parent frame and say, hey, store this for me. So I'll go into a little bit more detail later as to exactly what the data is and kind of who you're sending it to, because obviously you don't want to say, hey, this is my state, I'm just going to send it to whoever is above me. Because if it's any other website, they could capture that data and then store it when they're not supposed to have access to it. So you can restrict who you're sending that data to. And then in the same sense, when you get it back, you make sure that you're getting it back from the correct people. So here again, when I then want to get my state back, so I've put my state in my box. If I want to get it back, I do the same thing, but this time call up to the parent frame and say, hey, this is this data that I put there earlier, give it back. And that's in essence the high level of what this flow is going to do. We started off calling it a cookie shim, because in essence we are kind of pretending to be a cookie. We moved away from that because it doesn't quite give you the full functionality that a cookie does. We only do strict domains. So example.tool cannot set things for its subdomains, and its subdomains cannot access things from its parent. These were some restrictions that we put on it to kind of simplify the implementation and make things a bit easier. But so it's not an exact cookie shim, but it gives you an idea of what it's capable of. So if we dig in a little bit deeper into how that works from an end-to-end, this is how it would look currently. So this is kind of your average OpenID Connect flow with a tool and a platform. So you see here, you've got a server that's hosting the platform, and you've got the server that's hosting the tool. And then in between that, you have the client, who is the client's browser. So the root or top here, and then the iframe in which the LTI tool has been loaded. So the first thing that's going to happen here is that the parent page is going to be loaded in the platform. An LTI link is going to be clicked on that page, and then the tool is going to be opened in an iframe. Okay, so it's being opened inside this iframe here. And usually what would happen is you'd set the state in a cookie, and then you'd redirect back to the platform to say, continue with the OpenID Connect login. And then the platform would do the LTI launch back into the tool. So you can see here where the colors change inside this iframe here. We've gone from the blue of the tool. We've navigated back to the orange of the platform, and then we've requested back to the tool again. So here we're looking at the state that was set in the cookie. So if we didn't have access to cookies, we would fail here because we wouldn't be able to find the cookie where the state is stored. So if we have a look again at how we do this with the new flow. Now, this looks a lot more complicated because there's a lot more words on it. But the only reason it looks a little bit more squished is because I've included the actual payloads that are sent here and here. The actual flow itself is pretty much identical to how it was before. The only difference is that rather than us setting the cookie here, we're instead using window post message to pass the state value up to the platform and say, store this in your storage. And then we're also getting it back again when we do the launch and checking the state in the front end. So if we go through this kind of piece by piece, the first thing is the initial third-party login initiation request here. There is an extra parameter that we added called LTI storage target. And by default, you can set that to parent, which just means that this is being stored in the parent frame. You also have the option of storing it in a different frame to the parent. So this is for the case where the parent might not actually be the same domain as the domain that is registered in the LTI registration. So what we do is we require the tool to use the domain of the OpenID Connect return login endpoint. And they have to use that exact origin. Otherwise, what would happen is you could basically force a tool into storing your data in the wrong place. So by limiting it to that origin, you can say, hey, it's always going to be that origin. I trust that because it's already a pre-registered domain as part of, and pre-registered origin as part of the LTI registration. And you're always going to send that data back to it. So that's what we're doing here. For the moment, we're just going to show the simple flow. The simple flow is that we call the parent. So this is signifying that, yes, we support this storage, and the parent is where you're going to store it. And then here, rather than setting the cookie, we're going to return to a HTML page, which is going to make a request here calling window.parent.postMessage, and it's sending a subject, which is just saying, I want to put some data. It's got a key and it's got a value. You can see here, I've got the key is state hyphen, and then the state value, and then the value is also the value. The reason that I do this, it's actually a good practice, even when you're setting the state through a cookie, that you don't just use one key as your kind of ID for that, because if you're a tool that is loaded, for instance, in an editor or a text editor or something like that, and you're embedding multiple things into one page, if they're all loaded at once, you don't want to have the states overlap. So it's a good idea to use different keys. But outside, here we've set the key and value. You can see here that the platform is then just storing that in a local variable inside its JavaScript, in its memory. And then the platform returns back and says, here is the key and value that was set, and returns the same subject, but dot response to say that it's a response back to the tool. Once the tool's received this response, it knows, yep, that was set successfully. So continue on and redirect to the same auth endpoint that it would usually do through the OpenID Connect. The flow continues as usual. So exactly the same for the platform. It's going to do another LTI launch. Additionally, the storage target is also passed on the launch as a query parameter. This means that because we're not going to have any cookies set, we can't store state here to know, hey, I've got to use the storage. So because of that, it's up to the platform to signal, yes, I support this each time. So here you can see that's been passed. We're going to do our usual checks to get the JWKS, and we're going to validate the ID token. And we're only going to validate the ID token. We're not going to validate the state yet, because we can't validate the state on the back end because we don't have a cookie to check it against. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to load the front end, and then the front end, before it allows the user to continue, will call up to the parent frame again, and this time it's doing a get data, and it's just passing the key. And in response, it gets the key and the value. If it didn't get that, it would get an error back if the key wasn't there, or if the key didn't match, it would you'd know that it wouldn't match, and you'd be able to then log the user out or present them with a screen, say, hey, sorry, you can't continue any further. And that is kind of what the full end-to-end looks like. This is probably the most common use case that's going to come up. There are a couple more hoops that you have to jump through if, for instance, your tool is on a different domain during the first hop of the OpenID Connect flow compared to the second hop. So one of the things that's taken us a little bit longer to iron out in this specification and get it to the point that it's at is going through all of these edge cases where what if the tool has different domains? What if the platform has different domains? How will all of these things work together? And what are you going to do to allow that to happen? So we wanted to make sure that all of that was covered and yeah, make it as easy as possible to implement. So talking about easy to implement, next thing is to do a demo. So this demo is going to be of Blackboard and Turnitin, and this is currently in development code. I haven't pushed this out to production yet, but hopefully it will be very soon. And I'll show you how it works. So let me get up. Okay, so here I've got a Blackboard environment, and you can see I'm just in a course, and on that course I've got this Turnitin cookieless assignment set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to launch into that. I should also mention that I'm in no cookies mode in my browser. So you can see here that third-party cookies are being blocked, which means that anything that is not on the same origin inside an iframe won't have access to cookies. But here we go, we've just gone all the way through the OpenID Connect flow, and here we are in Turnitin, and everything's been approved, and we're successfully logged in. So we can see down here what that flow looks like. And so here I'm logging out the post messages that are being sent back and forwards. So you can see here there's actually a capabilities request being made first. So this is optional for the tool to make. It's required for the platform to support. That is just a way for the tool to be able to say, do you support these post messages, and which capabilities do you support through post messages? At the moment, we've just got the two of put and get data. So if you look at the request that I'm sending here, we've got the subject, I'm just asking for capabilities in my message ID. And then in the response, Blackboard is just saying, yes, I support capabilities. That's why it's just returned this data. And then it's also returning get data and put data. In this case of Blackboard use a different frame for doing the storage. So it's saying the frame that you've got to target rather than window.parent if you want to do get data or put data is one called LTI storage frame. So again, in our documentation, we explain exactly how all of this is called and you know, how it's all laid out, but it makes it fairly simple to do. So here we've got the request and response. You can see here that the actual time between this, these are requests and responses within the browser. So it's just one frame calling in one another. It's not having to make any server-side calls to do this, hence why the request time is 3 milliseconds and 2 milliseconds. It's very quick. It doesn't add any massive overhead to what's going on. So if we look at then the put data, again, same thing, request. So you can see where it's being sent from. You can see that I'm targeting this frame. That was the data that we put in, and we got exactly the same data back, but the subject was the same subject, but with .response on the end. And then when we then wanted to do the get, in this case, I'm doing another capabilities request because it's a new request here. So I always do a capabilities request before it. I just like to know what are the capabilities they have. So do capabilities request and then do the get. And you can see here in my get request, I'm requesting this specific state. And in a response, I'm receiving that state and the value that also contains the state. So because I got that response, I know everything's good, and it's all matching up, which means that the user can continue. If it didn't match up, then we would log the user out and show them an error page. So from a request point of view, it's the same as it would be normally. So if I can find the first request, so here, so this is the first request in the OpenID Connect login. I pass, everything is passed that would usually be passed, including the web message target on Blackboard's one that needs updating to the, again, this is still in development, so that's not currently using the newest name for the variable that we chose there. So yeah, that signals that, hey, we support this. Then we do a redirect back after we've set the state. So we're doing the redirect back to the platform here, so back to Blackboard, and we're passing our state and all the other values that it needs. Oops, sorry, that's, yeah. And then, yeah, sorry, that one. So yeah, passing the state and all the other values back that it needs, and then finally the launch back to Turnitin again with that same state and the ID token. So the normal LTI flow, just using post messages and the platform storage to store the state and allow us to get through all that. Another benefit of this is that it can be used beyond just the state for the OpenID Connect flow. Once the OpenID Connect flow is done, the tool can use that storage to store other values if it wanted to keep track of where it is, so that if it does get navigated away from in the iframe and then back to, it can call back up to the platform and know that what its state is, where it currently is, or what its session might be. So that is the demo. And if go back to this. Right, so where we're currently at now is, as you can see, we have working demos of it. We have end-to-end implementations from Turnitin, Blackboard, Sakai, D2L, I believe, have an implementation. If it's not released yet, there's Canvas have got a proof of concept for it. So a lot of the LMSs out there are all working towards getting this implemented, so that right out of the gate, there's going to be good support for it. But before we can release it, we need everybody's feedback. So especially people who have security knowledge or anything like that. We've done a fair amount of security review on this. We've poked all the holes that we possibly can and fixed all the ones that we found. But obviously, the more the merrier when it comes to reviewing it. So the other thing here is, does this solve the issue? because we're not doing a one-to-one shim of cookies. There are some edge cases where it's not going to do everything that everybody wants. So we're storing things in the browser, in the platform, and the platform might only store that data whilst the LTI tool is open. And then if in the platform you navigate away from that and then come back, you're not going to have that same storage data. So tracking a user across multiple sessions, or knowing they went into this resource and then came out of it and then went into this other resource and it was the same session. We can't quite track that at the moment, but we hope that this solution at least goes a way to get the applications working in the first place and kind of end to end and in a way that it's still usable by everybody else. So yeah, so if anybody has any additional concerns or questions or anything like that around how it's done, or does want to kind of dig into the nitty-gritty of the details around it, please come forward to the working group. So we have a specific working group dedicated to just trying to fix this cookie issue. And yeah, we'll happily listen to people if people have other ideas on how things can be improved and what else can be solved. So then I suppose the last couple of things on here is documentation resourcing. So we've been working on documentation on, part of it is outreach like this to get people informed. Just making this presentation gave me some ideas on how we can best explain what's going on. In the demo that I did, I've been writing a lot of stuff to present all of that logging in a nice way, so that you can see the request and response coming back. Because post messages aren't something that your browser usually has a nice kind of monitoring feature for, where you can just see back and forth in post messages. So being able to add all of that in, add in documentation and improve that will hopefully benefit the adoption of this. So if anybody has any specific places where they would like kind of more in-depth documentation, or they feel like certain bits are going to be a blocker and we should expand on them, then please let us know on that front. And then yeah, so if you feel like this doesn't solve your problem, and that actually the workflow that you have is somehow different, and it's going to cause real issue to implement this, and kind of any restrictions that it puts in place, again, please let us know. As I said, with dealing with domains about tenancy and having different domains for the login initiation versus the launch, we've tried to cover all of the use cases. We've got a fairly diverse set of use cases in the tools and platforms that are part of the working group, but we're always happy to hear more that people have, and yeah, anything else like that. So I think from that there's Q&A. So there's been some chatter in the chat which I haven't been following.
Yeah, I'll explain the two questions that came up in our answers, and then you can expound on them if you want, Martin, or if anyone wants us to follow up. So the first one, sure, from Charles White, I believe, was about asking whether if the platform has multiple app instances on the server side, if that would confuse the key value pairs. And since this data is stored in the client side, in the browser itself, the server architecture does not affect this particular issue. So it's a client side handling of it. And so that should be okay. The next one's a great question from Dan. When the user changes in the platform, so someone logs out, logs back in, should all the variables that the tool asks the platform to store be cleared? And Yes, they should be cleared. The kind of default implementation we recommend on this is storing these values just in your JavaScript state. And so anytime you navigate to a different page in the LMS, that state would actually be cleared, generally speaking. But there are other ways to implement it where the platform may want to explicitly clear those and make sure they're not accessed by different users. And so that's a case we're not covering in our guides at all.
Yeah.
Discuss that, so that's a great one to bring up. So
yeah, it's worth noting on that one that both sides of this happen in the user's browser. So if there are two different users, it is the same browser being logged in and out of it's one person behind the computer in a sense, maybe using two different users in an LMS. So that would kind of behave the same way that you would have with cookies as a worst case scenario. That if I had logged into my LMS, which is Blackboard as an instructor, and then launched into Turnitin, and that logs me into Turnitin as that instructor. If I then log out of Blackboard and log into Blackboard as a student, then launch into Turnitin, well, I'm already logged in as an instructor, and those cookies are already set there normally. So it would work in kind of the same way as that, that it would be up to the tool and the platform to handle that. If the platform gave back, hey, this session already exists in here, it's still only going to exist within kind of the confines of that user's browser. It's not like it's everybody that logs in and out of Blackboard has access to everything that's being stored. It's still just within the browser.
And also another note to that particular use case, the use case we're talking about now is doing an LTI launch, and we're validating a specific state value that's a single use state value for a particular LTI launch. And so once that launch is done, that it's not going to, that data is no longer valuable for a next LTI launch. If they're storing other things in there because they want to, the point still very much stands, but the state value in question for this is not particularly valuable later. Okay, Martin, there's a next question. Is there a way for the tool to clear the stored data when the tool doesn't need it stored anymore?
So there isn't currently a way of removing that data, because the data is not designed to be persisted really beyond the session of the platform's browser. Again, it might be something that we want to add down the line to kind of bring in more functionality there, but at the moment, no, there isn't any way of explicitly saying I want this value removed. You can overwrite a value. So if you'd set a value called session and you wanted to log the person out by removing that session, you could set the session value again as a blank value, and that would overwrite it.
David Brooks, in relation to the previous question, does that mean the state value is only retrievable once? No, it doesn't mean that. Generally, the state value will live for one page load inside the LMS, and if the tool asks for it in that iframe multiple times, we would expect the platform to return it if it still has it. So even though it's generally only needed once, the life of it is a page load, generally speaking.
Yeah. So if we look at this diagram here, where we have the browser kind of root frame and the iframe that the LTI tool is loaded in. So the root frame is the platform, and here is where the storage is happening. So as long as this window persists, this iframe, you can kind of navigate anywhere you want within there, and as long as you're calling back up to this window and this window still exists, then you will be able to retrieve it. Generally, if this window doesn't exist, it means that this iframe won't exist either, because the window will have changed. So at that point, you would go through another LTI launch to launch back into the application. But there's no limit on the number of times that you can call to get the value.
All right, I'll still post my answer to Dan, but Dan said, interested in having the tool generate a JWT and ask the platform to store it and persist it. The tool could then query the parent window on demand to retrieve user info from the JWT. And that's definitely, Martin kind of alluded to that. If you navigate somewhere else inside your tool, you could go fetch this again and reinstitute your state. The thing we're currently recommending is, the state validation replacement for the OIDC flow. If you're doing other values in that, there are more security considerations and context you need to think through, and whether that's just like that cookie problem. You might still be logged in the tool, even though you're logged on the LMS. You have to be more careful around any more sensitive data than the state. And it definitely is possible to do those things, but there's more considerations, and we're not making any specific recommendations in that area right now, but there's definitely stuff you can do there that's interesting for sure.
Yeah, so you might want to call up to the parent and say, hey, store this JWT for me, but you got to remember that you are passing that JWT to the parent. And so because of that, if you have any PII or anything like that in that, or something that you don't necessarily want to be read by the platform should just treat it obviously as an opaque string, but you're still passing it to a different party. So if you were to do that, you would probably want to encrypt your JWT rather than just signing it, and then you would kind of fetch it back and then pass it back to yourself.
And
to
Martin, I think
unencrypt
you
it.
just hit a good way for us to explain this in the documents when we cover this point, and that is the state value that we're validating for the OIDC flow is kind of a shared workflow data piece between the tool and the platform, and it's okay for the platform to see that because they already get it as part of the OIDC flow, and so that they're holding it and returning it is, it's already an expectation that they understand what the value is. If there's any values that the tool would own that the platform should not be aware of, those are the kinds of data that you would not want to put in there, because then you're spreading the scope of who's capable of seeing your tool only data. And so that might be a kind of line people will want to draw on using these.
Yeah, so to Greg's latest question on here, saying that the validation is happening in the front end here rather than on the tool server side. So the reason for the validation happening in the front end is because the back end has no way of calling to the platform's front end through post message to actually get the value of the state to compare it against. So it's also worth noting that the reason why you can do this here, in that you can just validate the ID token and then come in here and do the validation in the front end, is if you look at the issue that the state and kind of the security implications of what it's trying to solve, it's solving a forced login where I, as a bad actor, force you to be logged in as me, right? So because of that, what you want to do as a tool to prevent that is that if you detect somebody has been logged in as the wrong person, you want to log them back out again. So here what we're doing is, before the user does any interaction with the site, we're doing that check. So as long as that check happens before the user can interact with it, it doesn't actually matter that the user gets logged in as the bad actor, as long as it is detected and reversed, because otherwise the bad actor, in a sense, is already giving up their information in an attempt to log you in as them. So it's not an issue with kind of, the data being passed when it shouldn't be. You just need to make sure that that check is done in the front end to say, does the state match? Yes or no? If it doesn't, then something's up with this session. There's a crossover here that shouldn't be happening, and we should end the user's session now.
We didn't want to overcomplicate the possibilities of how this works, but the other probably also common flow on the tool side there at the end, though, is when you fetch that state value via the post message, you might just do your own AJAX call and say, hey, we validated this, now give us the user session. It's kind of, slightly opposite of what Martin has there, and that will probably be a very common way as well. But yes, it is essentially getting validated client side instead of state.
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways that you can do this. The reason that in this diagram I showed it this way is this is the closest to this, with the kind of the fewest changes to people's workflow. In this one, you could also have this validate ID token rather than doing this here as part of this launch. For the initial launch, you could just return straight back to your front end, do your state check first, then send your ID token and your state. Well, you just need to send your ID token to your backend after that to actually do the login, and then you'd get your session. And that way you can avoid ever actually having to log them in before the state is checked. So you can get around both of those ways if you want to avoid logging in people in the first place. Again, this is just kind of a demonstration flow of how to do it with the least impact on an existing LTI implementation that somebody might have.
And that's a good, the approach of the work group has been to, this again looks kind of complicated because of all the flow diagrams, but it's the same kind of number of steps roughly. And we tried to make it as simple for the tools out there as possible, because there's hundreds of tools, and low dozens of platforms. And so, the emphasis of the work group is trying to get this available on all the platforms as soon as possible. And then the tools will work exactly as they do now. This is completely backwards compatible. And it's, tools as they're hitting problems being embedded in iframes will be able to just add this solution on top of what they're already doing. And just have a nice seamless upgrade path. So we're trying to make it simple for tools and give them all the paths they need without having to understand every nitty-gritty details. So that's kind of part of our goal, is it's simple to understand and implement by tools. We're working on the simple parts of all of that. I think that'll be an important part of the documentation, but that's our hope.
Yeah, and providing things like example JavaScript of how to do the put and the get for making the post requests. Is another way that we can make implementation of this a lot simpler for people. So, are there any more questions around this people have? Concerns, hopes, dreams?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Martin and Bracken, as well. If nobody has any other questions or comments, I guess we can wrap this up here. And I want to thank everybody for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Good.